Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 11th of November 2023. And as I said in my first news video today, which is on my other channel, please check it out if you haven't seen it. You might not have seen it pop up on your news feed if you are just looking for ATP Geopolitics. Sometimes I struggle with YouTube and they restrict certain videos and whatnot, so I get to posting on my other channel as a result. So I want to say, to all veterans, and because I believe in America, is it Veterans Day? In the UK, this is Armistice Day, this is Remembrance Day, and we remember the fallen of all the conflicts, and indeed on both sides. We must remember that people fight on both sides of wars, and they aren't always, it's not always good versus evil, and people are drafted into war against their will sometimes and end up fighting and dying for a cause that they don't agree with, and that can happen on both sides, admittedly. So it's useful to remember that just humans die and families lose loved ones. But in today, I particularly want to remember those fallen in Ukraine, and particularly the Ukrainians fighting for their homeland, where, they have been invaded. And it is much more, certainly from a geopolitical or political point of view, much more of good guys against bad guys, in a way that, say, you go to Israel, Palestine, it's so confusing and complex, and it is much more difficult to work out exactly where your allegiances lie. I mean, that's how I feel about that conflict. It's just so complex that I'm like, well, you guys are doing some bad things there, but I kind of understand what you're doing over there. But then you guys are doing some bad things there, but I understand what you're fighting for over there. And so I'm left in it with a completely nuanced understanding. That means that I struggle to go, yeah, you're the good guys. Yeah, you're the bad guys. I support you and I support you. There are elements of both of those sides that I support. And it's the idea that Yuval Harari said recently, which is that we need to understand that the victim can also be the perpetrator. And I see that on both sides in that. So it's really difficult for me to align myself with one side in that conflict. Whereas with Ukraine, I think it's just damned easy. It's like Putin is a narcissistic, megalomaniacal dictator that is doing terrible things by invading Ukraine. And so I stand with the Ukrainians so very firmly. Anyway, on to the actual news video. That's my preamble. We will go first to military aid and actually look at here some good news that Ukrainian pilots are already flying F-16 fighter jets in the sky in their training, according to the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force, Yuri Ihnat. So that's excellent. I presume that's in Romania, where they have the training facilities getting set up. It might not be. There are different theories about where training is taking place. I mean, Arizona in America, there could well be Ukrainian pilots flying there, because actually it turns out that I think the airframes have only just got to Romania in order to do that training. So where that is taking place, I don't know exactly. Canadian cabinet asks government for $385 million in military aid to Ukraine document. I've got to make a correction at the end of this video, a bit like Seth Meyers with his correction videos that I do often watch. I do get a bit of enjoyment out of that. Anyway, I will make a correction at the end of this video with regard to something I said with regard to, I said squeeze heads, I meant to say crush heads, in reference to Kids in Hall, great Canadian comedy program. Anyway, I digress. The funds will be used to, quote, provide equipment and services to Ukraine, which is defending its sovereignty, as well as firearms, drone cameras, pilot training, and tank maintenance. Excellent stuff from Canada there, being a really stalwart defender of Ukraine and a sister of Ukraine, because there is quite a considerable diaspora Ukrainian community in Canada, and I think they're quite heavily involved also politically speaking in Canada, and that's why you see quite a lot of strong rhetoric over there. Now, Estonia and Iceland don't have an army, sent an additional batch of military aid to Ukraine. Germany also took part in this. So, Estonia announces a power of cooperation at at work. Estonia and Iceland have sent the next military field hospital to Ukraine with transport vehicles donated by Germany. Stay well, friends in Ukraine. These Baltic nations, and here obviously Germany and Iceland too, but the Baltic nations have been so strong in their defense, in their support of Ukraine in terms of military aid as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of, per capita, as a percentage of, defense budget, so on and so forth. On all the metrics, the Baltics are doing an incredibly good job. Lithuania, in this same train of thought, boosts Ukraine's air defense with NASAMS launchers, these national Norwegian air defense systems. Ukraine has received, this is a cooperation between the US and Norway. Ukraine has received 2 launchers which will expand the operational capabilities of NASAMS systems donated by Norway and the US. Now, I don't know if these are already over there, whether these are the ones that were announced the other day by, I think, Zelensky, saying they're already being used. It could be these ones. I don't know. There's just a number of different nations who have donated NASAMS at different times, but that's excellent stuff. Lithuania, again in the Baltics, provides Ukraine with crucial shipment of anti-drone technology and generators. Quote, Lithuania continues to provide unwavering military support to Ukraine today. A crucial shipment of anti-drone technology and generators was delivered, offering essential technologies for modern warfare. These anti-drone resources play a vital role in countering the adversary, reported the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. And this is so useful because it is becoming very much a competition as to who can get drone advantage and who can get drone countermeasure advantage. And if Ukraine can eke out some kind of asymmetrical competitive advantage over the Russians along any part of the front line, then that will mean that they will be able to not only hit the Russians with their own drones, but also use drones for spotting in terms of HIMARS, gimlet strikes, or guided multiple launch rocket system strikes, that is, or counter-battery artillery strikes, or just simple artillery strikes. It's about drones at the moment, and if international partners can assist in that desire for an advantage, or assist in manifesting a real advantage with drones, then that is so super important. Right, talking about a sort of competitive advantage in terms of artillery, where you have things like the Panzerhauser 2000 self-propelled gun, the Caesar self-propelled gun on wheels, as well as the Archer on wheels with its incredibly high fire rate. These kind of bits of equipment are offering Ukraine that real advantage in range, in the sorts of ammunition that they're using as well, and their fire rates, so on and so forth. The only thing is the amount of ammunition. It's great to have all this kit, but you need a lot of shells to fire out of them. The Caesar 8x8 155mm wheeled artillery system on a Tatra chassis. Tatra is, I think, a Czechia, a Czech piece of kit supplied by Denmark in service with the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians, Ukrainians received a bunch of these from Denmark. Denmark were due to receive them themselves from France. These are French bits of kit, essentially, but they redirected them to Ukraine. According to open sources, Denmark has supplied Ukraine with 19 such systems, and that is a big old number of these, because these are pretty formidable bits of kit. Britain completes training of 30,000 Ukrainian troops ahead of schedule under the Interflex program. That's a program that yes, it's taking place in Britain, and it's predominantly British trainers, instructors, but also with the help of Kiwis, Aussies, Norwegian, other nations are involved in that training, other NATO nations and allies. This was announced by the British Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, and hopefully as we go forward that will continue. Because as I was discussing yesterday with Tim White and previously in other videos, the UK has slowed down its support, and I think that's largely due to having bare cupboards. So what can we do? Well, training is something that we can do that doesn't require huge amounts of equipment being donated to Ukraine. You're just literally giving them your time and effort and expertise. So if we can train them as much as possible, that will help. So that's, I think, why the UK is positioning itself in that respect, because it doesn't have the kit to give. Obviously, we can talk about the construction of kit and financing of restocking our own British kit going forward. That is a challenge for the British MOD. Right, German Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany, Annalena Baerbock, she's of the Green Party in coalition with the SDP. We also quote, we also have a lot to learn from Ukraine. At this time, our Ukrainian friends probably have more experience in cyber defense than all of us together. Investing in our partnership here also means developing our own potential. This is really great to hear. It's also very true. And that you can go back to looking at this kind of training, and there have been criticisms of the NATO training that has been provided for Ukrainian soldiers as to be not quite fit for purpose with what the Ukrainians particularly need. And it could well be a lot to do with the skills of the NATO trainers not being like a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. All Ukrainian soldiers pretty much will have more actual war experience than a vast majority of the NATO trainers. Like, they have been fighting now for almost 2 years in a war that is also possibly very different from the sorts of wars that NATO instructors have potentially fought in, if they fought at all. So going to Afghanistan is a very different theatre to Ukraine. This is trench warfare in Ukraine with a lot of mud, with a lot of technology that's been used in a different way to how things have been used maybe in Afghanistan, where there was a lot more air superiority, etc., etc., etc. So there are lots of dynamics there to do with the delivery of training that need to be looked at, but also we're going to get to a point where the Ukrainians themselves will have more expertise than many NATO trainers. And going forward, if they get accession into NATO, then it could be that the Ukrainians end up being the trainers. Now, I am the master. Right. Star Wars reference for those who are wondering what I'm talking about. Right, next report here that Czechia have released declassified list of military aid to Ukraine. So I don't know why this has suddenly come out, but anyway, Czechian Defense Ministry has released a list of military equipment transferred to Ukraine from the army stocks, which was previously classified. The document, dated November the 6th, shows the cost of the aid, 6.2 billion Czech crowns. That's more than 250 million euros. According to the document, between February 24th and October the 9th, Czechia has transferred. And just to go through some of this, because they've done a really great job in supporting Ukraine, 4 helicopters manufactured in 2005 to 6, 62 tanks from all the way from 1968 to 1993, 131 infantry fighting vehicles from 1973 to 99, 16 air defense systems from the 70s to the 90s, 47 vehicles from the 70s to the 90s, 13 self-propelled artillery howitzers, mainly from the 80s there, 84,860 shells for cannons and howitzers, 12 rocket systems, 4,900 rockets, 648 anti-tank guided missiles, 8,022 anti-vehicle launchers, 128 mortars, 17,400 mines, 4.2 million rounds of handgun ammunition, and other equipment. Some of the equipment was supplied from Czech warehouses. Some of it was provided by arms companies, so the private and the public sectors working together there. And Czechia is also heavily involved in refurbishing tanks as well. So getting hold of tanks from some stocks elsewhere, getting taken to Czechia, and then upgraded, old tanks upgraded, particularly Soviet tanks, really, the T family tanks getting upgraded for use in Ukraine. Now, Andrew Perpetua commented on my thread, and thanks, Andrew, for that. Really good to have him, watching my videos, but also reacting. So I was talking about how the UK has been behind the curve in terms of artillery shell production. BAE Systems weren't given a contract, I don't think, by the UK government until very late in the day compared to other countries. I was saying that was an area where we were slow, I thought, to react. I could be wrong. Anyway, he said the UK is actually better positioned than many other countries because they just completed upgrading and construction manufacturing lines. One of these is for missile type stuff, which has been subsequently massively mishandled due to mismanagement. The new factory was designed to streamline production, but mismanagement led to a fiasco that took months to resolve, and they're now trying to play catch up. Who knew there'd be mismanagement of procurement in the UK government? The other is a production line for 155 mil rounds, which I believe is the largest in Europe, including Russia, by the way. Wow. So this is a good bit of... He's spitting facts here, or at least I hope they're facts. In fact, there must be facts. Many of those shells Rheinmetall are producing are actually made in the UK. So I was talking about how Rheinmetall have really got to the forefront of the defense military industrial complex that is supporting the Ukrainian war effort. And they've really been a central focal point, possibly because Germany's geographically closer and they can build things that are more usefully closer to Ukraine than, say, a British concern. But BAE Systems has now gone into Ukraine and said, look, we're happy to build stuff in Ukraine as well as Rheinmetall, blah, blah, blah. But Andrew says a secondary problem, which could be... sorry, to go back, he says, in fact, many of the shells Rheinmetall are producing are made in the UK. I believe this production line can produce 2 million shells per year, but the problem is sourcing raw materials, namely steel. A secondary problem, which could be driven by the primary problem, is nobody buying that many shells. After all, what's the point of buying shells you know cannot be produced? But they cannot be produced because nobody is buying them. So it's the chicken and the egg. So it's like, we're not going to produce them because we haven't got an order, but you're not going to put an order in for them until you know we've got the steel. And actually, someone else says below, the bottleneck is actually with explosives, and that's something else I've heard. And he says, and not steel, but it probably is both. After all, chicken and egg problem. The steel has to be sourced, and in order to source it, you need to put in a large enough purchase order to get the attention of the steel manufacturers. At the end of the day, someone will need to put in a 5 to 10 year contract producing tens of millions of shells, if not one entity, then a group of entities. This goes towards the problem with procuring huge amounts of ammunition is the long-term sustainability of those production lines. So companies aren't going to set up production lines in factories, or indeed build factories for something that's only going to be demanded for like 2 years. Like if the prediction is that this conflict will be over in 2 years and then production's going to fall off, then we spent X million dollars building this factory, getting all the capital together, and these expensive production lines, and you are only, we'll make a loss on it over time. So we need to know that there will be orders in for this stuff going forward. Now, given that artillery is back on the menu in terms of international warfare, you can imagine that there is a long-term sustainable future for this. I mean, it seems horrible to talk about sustainable future for like weapons that kill people, but that's the nature of the beast. So, in this new era of international instability, I would hope that there is, more that we are more prepared amongst NATO allies, and hopefully those orders will come through and the bottlenecks will be, lubricated, and BAE Systems, for example, will be able to produce a shed load of stuff for Ukraine. Right, moving on to geopolitical things. Janet Yellen here, who's in charge of the Federal Bank, said significant consequences for Chinese firms aiding Russia's war. So US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen urged the Chinese government to crack down on businesses sending military aid to Russia. This is so super important. However, it's official. Biden is to meet Xi Jinping in San Francisco on November the 15th. That's only 4 days away, according to the White House. That is a massive meeting. So significant. I wonder what will be achieved. You want China not to be the enemy. So China is being laid out by media, by lots of analysts, by lots of military people as being the big threat going forward. But perhaps that's the wrong way of framing it, because if that's the way you're going to frame it, then you are producing a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they end up becoming the enemy. And that could be dangerous because China is a giant, right? And so perhaps this is a better way of looking at it. This is coming from, and this is such a good interview. If you've got some spare time today, go and listen to retired American general on the war in Ukraine strategy and the future from Ukraine the Latest. This was an extra bonus one they did when they went to America and did some podcasts in America. They also met up with loads of people, including people working with the ISW. And this is General James Jubic. who works with the ISW. He's now retired, but his views here, I think, are worth taking on board.
Where do you stand on China today and its threat to the United States and the broader West?
I stand in a place that recognizes that China is a fierce competitor and wants to establish itself as a world power. It doesn't have to be an enemy. That's a very tough line to walk back and forth on. Tough competitor, not enemy. But that's why God made diplomats. And we need the diplomatic corps now as much as we need a military corps. If we emphasize the military side too much, we'll make China an enemy. Some people say they're already our enemy. In some senses, I guess you could say that. They are trying to compete with us militarily. They do want to be the preeminent power, at least in their region, if not more expansive. And so you have to have a military arm that can check that. But at the same time, you don't want to start World War III. That's to nobody's advantage. And the best way to prepare for World War III is to have a strong military to check that angle and to build up your diplomatic and economic core. I think, at least from the United States standpoint, this new initiative with South Korea and Japan, very important. Vietnam, very important. Australia, India, very important. The Quad, that was a Japanese initiative, also very important. So there's a lot of activity going on in the Indo-Pacific that will help us in keeping the competitor alive and the enemy in check. And I think that's the trick. Will China, or has China already tried to take advantage of the Ukraine war? Absolutely. Will they continue to do that? Absolutely. But we've got to keep this perspective of competitor, not enemy, and work both at the same time. If we start thinking in either or, then I think we increase the probability of ungoodness unfolding in the strategic environment.
I thought that's really good. So if you just think of China as the enemy, then you have a self-fulfilling prophecy and they become the enemy and you're more likely to go to World War III. But if you think of them just as a competitor and don't prepare for the eventuality of a possible war, then you are kind of appeasing them maybe too much, a bit like with Putin over the last sort of 10 years plus. So you need to do both. You need to, right, you are a competitor first and foremost, but we also need to make sure that we're militarily prepared. But you need to be diplomatically prepared. And I don't want to just take an opportunity to bash Trump, but I believe in the Trump era, there was a lack of appointing diplomats around the world. A bit like the kind of, there's an issue with appointing military personnel due to Tommy Tuberville's actions in Congress. But I think there's been an awful lot of positions unfilled around the world from a diplomatic point of view for the Americans. You have to remember that this is why the Ukrainian war is so important for the US in ways that people like Vivek Ramaswamy and I don't know, Marjorie Taylor Greene and whatever in the US don't understand or aren't willing to talk about for whatever reason. The US is the hegemony, at the center of that kind of hegemony, that supreme power in the world. And if you want to stay there and reap the rewards of that economically, culturally, in terms of global intelligence and scientific endeavor and whatever, if you want to reap those rewards, then it's really important that you have your diplomats working bloody hard around the world to keep threats in check and to keep competitors in check, and working, as he said there, with Japan, Australia. You've got the Five Eyes, you've got the Quad, you've got places like Vietnam that are so super important, the positioning there and who their allegiances lie with, and then you've got the Middle East, and having to work the whole time very seriously to make things happen. I think, as far as I understood it, when the Democrats got in charge in what was it, 2020, they recognized foreign diplomacy as one of their big things, if I remember correctly, going back, goodness me, it seems like such a long time ago. But they wanted to get back to America being an important... So they've gone through this isolationist phase of Trump, of America first, and kind of forgetting the rest of the world. But you do that, you lose out in the long run. So, you have BRICS. If you want a world where there is another hegemonic status that doesn't have the US at the forefront, then fair enough. Sit back and be isolationist. You can do that, but I think in the long run, you will suffer economically or whatever. But if you are serious about maintaining yourself at the top of the international kind of power hierarchy, then you have to be concentrating a lot on foreign diplomacy. And that's, I think, where the Democrats were going. Now, I'm not trying to be pro-Democrat, anti-Republican here, but literally that's like America First policies were all about putting America first and not thinking about it was isolationist. I mean, this is kind of accepted now, and the Democrats wanted to reverse that, and it just depends how you interpret geopolitical needs for the US, I guess. Canada announces new sanctions targeting Russian propagandists. So very particularly, Canada is sanctioning individuals and entities who directly promote Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, this is really super important because actually the propagandists are the most genocidal. And if you, in terms of their rhetoric, goodness me, if you're going to sanction anyone, I think propagandists are going to be up there. Well, talking about propagandists, meanwhile in Russia, says Julia Davis of Russian Media Monitor, Vladimir Solovyov, so good old Solovyov, one of the main propagandists, introduced Apti Alaudanov as an, quote, extraordinary philosopher, and attentively listened to Alaudanov's theory that Israel is ruled by Satanists and that mini antichrists live on all iPhones, iPads and computers. I mean, Jesus wept. If someone espoused these views on British TV, they'd be laughed off TV. We wouldn't stand for that. But I don't know whether Russia's become so isolationist that the kind of rhetoric that you see on state TV is almost generating a cult-like thinking process and a cult-like behavior amongst many Russian members of the public. And I was kind of trying to talk about this with Tim a little bit yesterday. Sort of talked about how there is this kind of us against them narrative of Russia, where they're ensconced in their own borders, and they are being prohibited from traveling in many, can't take their cars into many parts of Europe. They are being sanctioned, this and that. They become this pariah state internationally, and they are prisoners in their own borders, and then they are just listening to their own narratives and own propagandists spout absolute abject nonsense to the point where they just become some almost huge 140 million strong cult. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going off on one. France, Germany, Italy and Belgium do not want to rush into a decision on the use of frozen Russian assets, according to Bloomberg. I talked about this yesterday, not wanting to do things in terms of turning Russian assets into liquid cash, giving that to Ukraine to support their defensive war efforts, only for there to be legal ramifications. So the governments of those countries are in favour of thoroughly closing all legal nuances and loopholes, as well as the introduction of special taxes on profits derived from frozen assets, about 200 billion euros. I did report that yesterday. Don't know why it's there again. Maybe I didn't delete it. Ukraine and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have reached agreements on the second review of EFF arrangement, which would enable disbursement of about $900 million, reports the press service of the IMF. Right. So the IMF is largely responsible, the World Bank as well, these different institutions, for helping Ukraine with its, basically, government, with the funding Ukraine as an entity, right? Now, there's been this move. There are these rumors out that America's going to stop providing financial assistance, kind of civic assistance to Ukraine, and they're just going to concentrate on military assistance. Some people are saying that in my threads. I've seen some talk about this. The problem with that is, if you don't have a government, if you don't have a country that's functioning, then what are they fighting for? Like, you can't just have an army. So you need everything, and so therefore you can't just support the army and not support all these other aspects. It needs to be everything. Now, that's fine for America not to do that if there are other entities to pick up where America said, we're not doing that now. A bit like I was talking about with Switzerland providing humanitarian aid or demining if they're not going to provide military assistance. Well, someone else does that, and together you get to the same point, right? Well, if the US are going to say, right, we're not going to do all these other kind of financing now, we're just going to concentrate on military aid, someone else will need to pick that up, because Ukraine, if Ukraine ceases to function as a civic entity, then the army has nothing it's fighting for, and it all falls apart. It's kind of all or nothing, would be my opinion. So just be wary about that. An anchor found near the Baltic connector, not the Balti connector, remember, that goes directly to my local Indian restaurants. But the Baltic connector gas pipeline damage site belonged to the Chinese container ship New Polar Bear. So this is what has been announced by Risto Lohi, the spokesman for the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, which is part of the police force. He added that the main part of the investigation has been completed, but there are still some technical aspects to be clarified. Right. Situation here is that's not going to be by accident. You don't drag an anchor that deep in the water in the middle of that shipping lane and take out a gas connector and a cables connector as well in several places. Like, that doesn't happen by accident, okay? Especially when that ship appears to be funded, when you follow the money, it appears to actually be part owned or funded by the Russians. And then when it got to port, the entire crew just suddenly swapped over and changed. It's like, there are so many dodgy things to do with this. That wasn't an accident. Right. Final thing I'm going to say, look, someone has actually caught a picture of Viktor Orban there. So I just thought I'd share that with you. That literally is one of the closest resemblances you could ever possibly imagine of Viktor Orban. Absolutely brilliant. Sorry, not sorry. And my correction. Right, I did a whole bit about squeezing Elon Musk's head, and I was referring back to an old Kids in the Hall head crush, and it's crushing his head.
Hey, Wall Street, don't panic. I mean, I'm only crushing your heads. Crush you. What the hell do you guys find to talk about anyway? I like to put my money into Texaco. Well, I like to put it in the Gulf. Well, I put my money in my mattress. Well, I put my money in my wallet. You're boring me. I'm crushing your head. I'm crushing your head. Hey, I just renamed your firm Merrill Lynch and a Flathead. I crush you.
So on and so forth. It's a great little sketch out. I do like it. Anyway, that's for my Canadian friends out there. Thank you for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.